again, hi, and thank you for doing this.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure to meet you and get a chance to chat with you. We've chatted a little bit getting ready for this. And, I've shared a little bit about the Augusta Players and our organization. And it's a place where a lot of local actors get their start. I'm curious, you've had a pretty cool career. Where are you from originally?
Well, I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, a place called Evanston, which is where Northwestern University is. And we had a very active high school theater program. So I was, playing character parts in high school. And also the school was very indulgent about letting me put up some sketches and one acts that I was writing. Nothing that I would show anybody today, but it was certainly, I was learning stuff as I was writing for the kids around me.
So you started writing right from the get-go.
Well, I actually knew I was going to be a writer from about the age of 6. My dad was a writer. My dad wrote PR for Northwestern and then for the University of Chicago. But, the early image of him sitting at a typewriter. Also, I grew up with a mimeograph in the house, and so I would occasionally mimeograph little projects and sometimes sell magazines door to door, homemade magazines door to door around the neighborhood, which made me enormously popular in the neighborhood.
For those of you kids that are watching, a mimeograph is like a photocopy machine, just in case you don't know.
Close enough, yes. You can make copies of something, right?
Right.
So I grew up with, books and typewriters and mimeograph machines and all that sort of thing, and having a father who wrote and a mother who was trained as a concert violinist.
Wow.
There's a lot of that stuff around the house, and a high school that was very active in actively engaged in putting up theater. We had several theaters in the building, and we had very dedicated teachers, and put up lots of shows. So between all that, then I was growing up in, as I say, a suburb of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And although at that time Chicago wasn't producing much that was original, we were a place where a lot of road companies would come, of road versions of Broadway shows. So I got to see a lot of Broadway stuff that was sent out on the road. And also we had a theater called Second City, which was the one sort of homegrown Chicago theater thing that was making a reputation in Chicago at the time. And all these astonishing people were coming out of Second City, all these comic geniuses, improvisers.
Right.
And that really had a lot to do with why I ended up, even though I lived in New York after I went to school, why I really connected very closely to the Chicago theater community. Because after getting out of college, I decided I wanted to read a book about this place, Second City. And it turned out that nobody had written it. So I thought, okay, I'll write it. So I went around and interviewed all the old Second City people. And I wrote a book called Something Wonderful Right Away. And because of that, met all these people in Chicago theater. And some of them said, come work with us. And one particular theater said, come work with us. And I started working with them, I don't know, what was it, 79 or 80? And worked with them for something like a little over 30 years, putting up 14 shows in that time. I was doing other stuff too. I was writing television and working in New York theater and writing books and teaching and just generally living my life. But one of the nice things was that pretty much whenever I finished a play, I would give it to Victory Gardens and they would schedule it for the next season. And give me a lot of say in who I wanted to work with. So I ended up working with actors I really wanted to work with and with directors I really wanted to work with. I mean, I had to earn this trust, that at a certain point they took my word for on actors that they sometimes had never met, but they just trusted me. But that was after having, they had successes with me, 4 or 5 successes in a row. And they said, oh, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. So when I recommended somebody, they let me have them. So
we grew up kind of as neighbors a little bit, because although I mentioned to you before, although I was born in Los Angeles, I grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just an hour north of you. and spent a lot of time in the summers just wandering around the Northwestern campus right on Lake Michigan. There, it's such a beautiful campus.
Oh yeah, it still is. It's bigger than it was, but it still is. And when I got out of Evanston Township High School, which was my high school, I went to NYU to study in their film program. And my film professor turned out to be Martin Scorsese, the young Martin Scorsese. You know, he gave me a B. And I also had a songwriting teacher who didn't give grades, and that was Paul Simon. So,
oh my gosh.
So, and also there was a fellow named Lehman Engel, who was starting something at the time that was revolutionary, which was he was training musical theater writers for an outfit called BMI. And so I was working on musical theater material, and my fellow students were Alan Menken and Ed Kleban and Maury Eston. So, and then, you know, some other fairly cool people came along later.
Sure.
But my first off-Broadway musical was a show that I wrote with fellow members of the BMI Musical Theater Workshop. They're people who said, hey, would you like to write the book for this musical? Because they knew me from the workshop.
What was that show?
There's an old comedy by a guy named Murray Shiskel called Love, L-U-V. Mm-hmm. And we did a musical version of it off-Broadway that flopped, starring Nathan Lane and Judy Kaye. A few years later, it was revived off-Broadway in a production that was much better, and that one did well, and it got picked up to be produced in Tokyo, where it ran for 2 years.
Who'd have thought?
They didn't invite me over to see it. I would have loved to have seen what Jewish comedy in Japanese looked like, but
that's hilarious.
I mean, it's the least personal project I've ever done, but it was a lot of fun to do. And it was, you know, 3-character musical of neurotic people on the Brooklyn Bridge, and but there was a connection to Second City in that the original production of the play was directed by Mike Nichols and starred Alan Arkin, and I ended up interviewing both Nichols and Arkin for my book about Second City. So you know, there was certainly a connection even on that. But
so I've got a couple. I want to talk a little bit more about your work, but 2 things first. I want to do a quick commercial. If the folks listening wanted to grab those books, are those things available on Amazon? Where would they go to look for your work? Books as opposed to plays.
Oh, okay. If you really want a crash course in my stuff, there's a book called The Value of Names and Other Plays, which you can certainly get from Amazon. Also, if you want to get sort of my theories on playwriting, there's a book called The Dramatists Toolkit.
Right.
That's available both in paperback and in a Kindle edition.
It's actually sitting on the other side of this wall on my bookshelf.
There you go. Anyway, so that's most of what I think I know about technically about writing plays. Because when I was an aspiring playwright, I was reading the various playwriting books, and frankly didn't find many of them of much use. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of them seemed to assume that playwriting was a literary activity, and I don't think playwriting is primarily a literary activity. I think it's an extension of acting. I think that if you break it down, there are only 2 absolutely essential elements to the theater, and those are actors and audience. It's possible to have theater without anything else. So it sort of follows that all of the other disciplines in the theater are extensions of those 2 functions. And if you take a look at the history of the theater, a huge percentage of the really good playwrights are people who started off as actors. And I don't think this is accidental, because playwriting is not primarily about words. It's about creating the opportunity for actors to create compelling behavior. Words are just the stuff that we can put down on the page, but we're really writing is suggestions for behavior, for things for actors to do that will compel attention.
It's very Stanislavski of you.
Very. and in fact, frequently the words are very inaccurate in terms of what the characters really feel or what they really want. one of the reasons why the Brits are so good frequently at playwriting is that they're so repressed that they very rarely articulate their emotions at all. So, I hate you is said, please pass me some more tea, this time with less sugar. There's a whole scene in what is it? The Importance of Being Earnest, where Gwendolyn and Cecily are on the surface being very polite, but one of them is loading up the other's tea with way more sugar than she wants, and so they're fighting over the objects. They're fighting over how much sugar is in the tea. I mean, how much more repressed can you get? But that's the fun of the scene,
right?
So yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that almost everything I think I know about playwriting is really an extension of what I understand about acting. And one of the things that's interesting about improvisation and improvisational theory, which is the foundation of Second City, is that almost all of the improvisational theater games that were created by Viola Spolin can be converted to playwriting exercises.
Mm-hmm.
This would not necessarily have pleased her, and I knew Viola, but still, she was interested in how do you get people quickly to bond together to create compelling behavior for the stage, and you can do that for the page as well. And in fact, a lot of the work I do has its roots in improvising. I'll get actors together, and we'll improvise based on a premise that I have, and maybe a single line or a point of attack on a scene will suggest something to me, and then it jumpstarts me so I can go off and write. I write also just straight at the keyboard, but sometimes I find that starting from improvisation is a great way to start a play.
It's a great tool. I agree. So the other question before I ask you a little more about your work is, our program has a great youth theater program that's doing a wonderful mix of brand new. Literally, we just premiered a regional premiere of a show called Anne and Emmett. That was a memory play about Anne Frank and Emmett Till meeting in purgatory. And then, also Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. It really runs the gamut. But we're starting a new program that is going to encourage a group of young people to do some volunteer work and then take those experiences and turn it into a play. Mm-hmm. So what kind of advice do you give to young writers, if any, as they begin this journey? Any thoughts on that?
Well, there are a few beginning ideas. One is, if you're going to build something from people who are really in the community, to try to understand what they want, what their objectives are. Behavior on stage, if what we're doing is presenting behavior on stage, all behavior is motivated. It's either motivated consciously or subconsciously, but people behave in a way in order to try to attain some kind of goal. And so if you're going to understand a character, you have to understand what they want and what they're willing to do to get what they want. The other thing is, look at the stuff that they surround themselves with. I sometimes think that if you did an exercise and said, say your home was on fire, what 5 things would you recognize? Not recognize, rescue. Mm-hmm. What 5 things would you rescue? In those 5 objects that were rescued, you'd have the beginning of somebody's autobiography, because you'd know what was valuable to them. And indeed, lots of scenes in plays, lots of the great scenes are about people fighting over objects. Shakespeare, whenever he brings an object on stage, wow, it pays off like crazy. Right. So anytime you have an object on stage and you can transform it or misuse it in some way, you're going to get a tremendous dramatic or comedic bang for the buck. Right. But Neil Simon knew it, Shakespeare knew it, Arthur Miller knew it, Lorraine Hansberry knew it. You just know that if you've got people are surrounded by objects which they use as a way of relating to each other, and whenever you fool around with those objects, you're going to make visible the nature of the relationship between the characters. So what are some of your favorite things that you've written for the stage? Do you have a favorite? Is that the cliche asking which is your favorite child?
Oh,
Oh, it's difficult. There's certain things that were kind of breakthroughs for me that were very helpful. The first decent play I wrote was a play I wrote when I was 23 called Porch, and I was lucky in that it got done off Broadway on a budget of about $500, and I got a good review out of the New York Times on it. Well, it was funny. There was a theater that was putting on an opera called Regina. In fact, I had suggested that they put on the opera, and there was a porch set in Regina, which I'd forgotten. And I said to my friend, "Oh, as long as you've got a porch anyway, you could put my show on for next to nothing." And they said, "Okay, on the dark nights, we'll put on your show." So because, the set was already there, we just used a set that was already there for the opera. So that's why it was so cheap to put on. And then I was lucky, and the lead critic for the New York Times had read my Second City book and had a free night, and he came to see it and gave it a good review, and that led to a production in Chicago, and that production turned out to be a surprise hit. And then the theater said, "Hey, stick around, keep working with us."
And 14 years later.
So I did 13 more shows over the next 30 years. Yeah. So it was, but so Porch, and it's the earliest play that I've written that doesn't embarrass me. Anything before that, I go, I got it, but then there was a play called The Value of Names, which was a play about the aftermath of the blacklist, and that ended up probably having more productions than anything I've done. There was a wonderful actor named Jack Klugman, who was
Speaking of The Odd Couple, yes.
Yeah, best known for the TV version of The Odd Couple. He also did a series called Quincy, and he was in some movies, and he was the original Herbie Gypsy. Anyway, he became obsessed with this play of mine and ended up doing it in 6 theaters. And so people would show up to see Jack Klugman because he was a star, but since he was doing my play, they had to pay me royalties. So it was they thought they were seeing Klugman, and they were, but they were also seeing one of my plays, and so that was very satisfying. And that play keeps getting done. Another play called Flyovers, which was enormously satisfying. I wrote a play that Steppenwolf is a theater that was in town in Chicago, a very famous theater. And I thought as a challenge I would write a play that would be a good play for Steppenwolf, and so I wrote it. And Steppenwolf wasn't interested in producing it.
Oh no!
So my home theater decided to produce it, and we ended up producing it with Steppenwolf actors. So we had Amy Morton and William Peterson and Gary Cole, and it won the award in Chicago for the best play of the year. So I got a Steppenwolf production at Victory Gardens.
How appropriate that you won a Jeff Award.
Yeah, that won the Jeff Award. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was very satisfying. And then some of these plays have come to New York, sometimes off Broadway, sometimes off Broadway, and that's been very satisfying. I mean, I've never had anything on Broadway, and I haven't had any big film sales or anything, although I've written a certain amount of television. But
including, so I have to take a left turn for a second.
Yeah.
How did you end up running for soap operas?
Well, that's a weird story. There was a wonderful actress named Margaret Lynn who died young, and she had kind of a tiny obituary in the New York Times. And I wrote a letter to the New York Times saying she was really a remarkable actress, even if she wasn't a star, and more attention should have been paid to her because we who are writers all admired her and loved working with her. And the Times published the letter. Then a few days later, I got a phone call from a woman named Corinne Jacker, who said, "I'm a head writer on Another World now, and I'm hiring you to write the show." I said, "You mean I've got an audition?" She says, "No, I've read your stuff. You can do it. You're going to come and write for the show." And then I discovered, although she never said it to me, I discovered that Margaret had been one of her friends. So she became aware of me because I'd written this letter to the New York Times, and she, I guess, was moved by the letter and decided that she wanted, and mind you, she never told me this. I just figured it out later. But that's not a career choice that you can follow. You're not going to get hired because you wrote a letter to the New York Times.
Right. But I think it's a great example of you never know, especially in the arts, where that opportunity is going to come from. I very easily could talk to you for a couple hours, and I know that your words of wisdom also would be great for our actors here as well as our youth actors. But we've got a bunch of other guests that we got to get to this evening yet. Let's, before we go though, just talk a little bit about kind of what's happening in the world right at the moment. How is your second home, or I guess your original home of Chicago, faring in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I have a theory that what's going to happen is that the big cultural institutions are going to be rescued. So, the Goodman Theater and the Steppenwolf will probably come through it okay. And I think that the absolutely broke institutions that run on next to nothing will be okay because they're not losing money to begin with. My wife runs a nonprofit organization that's got a very tiny budget. So we're going to be fine because we're not, we don't have to pay rent. We don't have a managing director who's on salary. So we'll be fine. It's the institutions in between that I worry about, the mid-level theaters. And I think that we're going to see, a substantial portion of them will find it very difficult to come back. And that's what I really worry about, because it's those mid-level companies that are in fact doing a lot of the new work. And so I think it's going to be very difficult for companies that do new plays and do new work. Chicago has got a tremendously cohesive theater community. I don't know if you know, there's a wonderful new book that came out recently called Ensemble by a man named Mark Larson, which is an oral history of Chicago theater. Big, fat brick of a book. But if you read that book, you realize the reason why it's called Ensemble is that the Chicago theater community, they all consider themselves to be part of one ensemble. There are 200 theaters, but everybody feels that they're in the same community. They are not competitive. They're cooperative. They're fans of each other. They love each other. They support each other. So I think that Chicago has got a better chance of coming through. It's important theaters who have coming through than I think some of the theaters in New York may have, because although there is a community of actors who and writers who get along very well in New York, the institutions are fairly competitive in New York. Mm-hmm. And I think that competition in the long run will not be as useful to New York theater as the spirit of cooperation, which is paramount in Chicago, will be. I think Chicago's going to come through it better than the New York will. Also, the budgets in Chicago are so much smaller.
Right.
So that's another reason why they're more likely to. That's more likely to survive. But
that's a little bit of what's happening here too. We have about 4 different theater companies, as I said to you before we started chatting in the interview, that we all have our own niche. But we're all trying to be very supportive of each other, because that's how, A, we want to be a community. We want to be an arts community. And B, that's part of how we're going to get through all of this, I think.
Well, theater is an expression of the community. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's about people getting on stage and facing the community. And either they celebrate the values of the community, so they do, upbeat musicals and comedies, or they challenge the values of the community. And they do, Ibsen and Sondheim and Albee and the stuff that Lynn Nottage, the stuff that's critical of the community. Right. But it still all comes down to the relationship between the players on stage and the community. And the players themselves should be part of the community and should feel that they are members of a community and feel a loyalty to each other and support each other. One of the things that's very heartening, I'm on the council of something called the Dramatists Guild, which is an organization.
But I'm a member, by the way.
Ah, great. Well, when I sit around the table with people who are mostly, Pulitzer and Tony winning playwrights and stuff, pretty much. But what inspires me is you hear Stephen Schwartz, who's, got to be insanely wealthy. But expressing his concern for how younger writers are going to manage and get by, and how they're going to cope, and really putting his energy and effort into supporting younger and less famous people, and that goes for everybody around the table. everybody around the table. I mean, you don't join the Dramatists Guild Council unless you care about other writers, unless you really want to support. And in fact, I would urge anybody who is a playwright, even if you haven't had a show produced professionally in New York, anybody who's a playwright to join the Dramatists Guild, either as an associate member or a full member, because you'll get that support. There's a community there that is eager to be helpful. People have this image from watching, movies and TV shows like Smash, that everybody is got sharp elbows in show business and is just trying to, screw each other over. And there's some jerks out there, but mostly I find the theater community is really quite familial and quite and cares about each other a great deal. So it's one of the reasons why I like doing theater more than I liked doing television, where they really didn't give much of a damn.
And that's very much the case in our community as well. I want to talk with you, and I actually really want to introduce you to the artistic director of our youth program as well, who I'm going to be chatting with in just a little bit. But so maybe we can do this again some other time.
I'd be delighted.
Yeah, you're just a joy to talk with, and I've learned a lot from the Dramatists Toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you.
As a writer in all of my spare time. So I appreciate that. Thanks for taking the time today. And look forward to what comes next for you as a writer once we get through all of this, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you. You've been very kind.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Folks, it's Jeff Sweet, an incredible writer, person, and playwright.